All right. So now we're in the post World War II or World War One era, the post Depression era, 1933, um, in the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal program. This is trying to recover from the Depression. Farmers are given benefit payments in return for limiting acreage given to staple crops. This is now something that happens in part of the Farm Bill currently to this day. And so it helps with trade, it helps with prices. If all of a sudden everybody says, I want to grow wheat, and we got so much wheat, the price of wheat crashes, and it's an economic disaster. And it creates problems domestically here in the United States. It also creates problems for trade. So in order to balance this out, you can't just have individual families going bankrupt and starving to death. You need to have some sort of stabilizing factor in the economy, in the economics of agriculture. So some growers are actually paid not to grow things. And it might sound crazy at first, but it actually makes a lot of sense. And most of the farmers that I know that have taken advantage of this, it's not like they're being lazy and not growing anything or doing anything. They're still working their tails off. There are examples, and I would say that in current times, corporate interests that are taking advantage of some of these farm bill monies that are being paid out. I can see why that pisses off some people. And there are some things in the farm bill that we got to look at. Again, it's about money. It's about how we balance our money. The idea is supposed to be to protect family farms, which I'm all for. But if you've got $1 billion corporation, do you need to protect them by manipulating what they grow, or paying them to not grow things? That's a discussion for something else. There's some wonderful things in the Farm Bill, and there's some things that I say are questionable at times. But we want to support our ag. We do want to support our ag. We want to support our small family growers so that they can keep their head above water, keep going, keep working, keep doing the good work of ag. So that's enough on that. 1935, the National Labor Relations Act establishes the National Labor Relations Board. There's another one of those regulatory agencies that exists for a purpose. They form the regulations for the laws, and they exist because a law says they must exist. Here it is in 1935. Now there's an organization that looks at labor relations issues. Social Security Act, again, another huge issue coming out of the post-Depression era. And I don't care which side of the political aisle you sit, our congressional leadership has not done a good job of keeping our Social Security money in the Social Security accounts, and has pretty much used it as their own little personal bank account for budgetary purposes. And that's a big problem. So there's a lot of issues with Social Security today. It is not a welfare type program. It is money that we as citizens pay into. It is our money as citizens. And that money is to provide a safety net for the workforce. When you become too old to work, when you become sick, if you die before you reach retirement and you've got kids left behind, this money is there as a safety net for our society. And it is in jeopardy from mismanagement. 1938, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act passed. Fair Labor Standards Act establishes the wage and hour division. So now we have specific rules for actual wages and how that works. Lots of detail in there. Very, very interesting topics when it comes to wage. And then boom, World War II. but we were not part of it yet. So we're still moving forward. We have the Federal Seed Act required truthful labeling on vegetable seeds, grade standards issued for frozen peas, again, trying to standardize things. So not a whole lot happened in that era just before World War II, but once World War II hit, that was it. There wasn't much done in terms of laws and regulations. We were kind of busy with other priorities at the federal and state levels. The one thing that did happen was a lot of research, as I mentioned before, advances in food production, health, and pest control, as well as manufacturing and other types of things. Research was going on, not new laws and regulations. And then there was the post-war period that it took a few years after 1945, when the dust was settling from World War II. It took another several years to get our feet on the ground, start developing the economy. It was all about post-war recovery. And one of those things was the development of the Agricultural Research Service. What it doesn't say here, and what you need to know, is the Agricultural Research Service is a division within the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA ARS, Agricultural Research Service. And they have a facility right next to the Hartnell College Alice-Al campus on East Alice-Al Road. And very important. They're all over the United States and even some international research locations. Very, very important to this day. 56, Fish and Wildlife Act with the Commercial Fisheries Bureau and Sport Fisheries and Wildlife Bureau, all of these, again, trying to stabilize the foundation of agricultural interests. 1957, the Civil Rights Act. Again, I told you there were several Civil Rights Acts. We had a Civil Rights Act that occurred coming right out of the Civil War. And a lot of people think the Civil Rights Act, something in the early 60s. Well, that was more of a closing of the gaps, some fixing of some problems. But the real start of the civil rights movement legislation was in 1957, earlier than people usually are told. So this was all about voting rights and equality. Although, some people think voting rights, it was like voting rights got fixed in one act, one law. And no, voting rights, it took so many years and so many different things to fix, because you had voting rights not only for Blacks, but for Native Americans, for women, for all kinds of different problems that had to be fixed. And it was fixed over a whole long period of time. But in 1957, this was an attempt to establish fundamental civil rights that still hadn't been achieved, that should have been achieved decades earlier. 1962, so this is the beginning of the environmental period. During the 1950s, there was a whole bunch of public interest in the environment, in public health, in worker health and worker rights, and all of these things were starting to build up in this post-World War II era where, you remember earlier I said something about, this was the post-World War II was about prosperity and growth, and everything was wonderful in this fantasy world. No, it wasn't wonderful. And people started to realize this isn't right. Something's wrong with how we're doing things. We're growing, and expanding on our chemicals and research and plastics and all these things that are coming out of this post-World War II era, it's exploding in a way that's not sustainable. And we're taking advantage of workers, we're taking advantage of the environment. There was a saying way back then, the solution to pollution is dilution. Hey, if you've got a bunch of poisonous, toxic stuff, just throw it in the river, throw it in the ocean. It'll get diluted. The earth is huge. As long as we dilute it, it's fine. Things are only dangerous in concentrated amounts. If you dilute it, nothing's a problem. And that clearly wasn't true. In some ways, when we have a very small population or a very small amount of pollution, that maybe is true to an extent, but people started to realize this isn't right. So by the end of the 50s, the public already had this undertone, bubbling fear about what's going on in this country. What are we doing to the environment in particular? Along comes a book at the perfect time by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring. Now, I don't have her name on this particular slide, but her name is Rachel Carson. And she wrote the book Silent Spring specifically about a chemical called DDT. And I'm not going to say the full name, but DDT was this miracle pesticide that really did a lot of good in the world because it saved arguably hundreds of thousands of people from malaria during its use in World War II and other diseases from ticks and chiggers and lice and other problems. It was this wonder drug. It killed these bad insects and didn't harm people. And so there was this mentality, let's just make a whole bunch more of this wonderful DDT and spread it everywhere. And people started to realize, well, maybe it's not that good for people. Even though it's not directly toxic, it eventually does have some problems, but they're relatively minor in humans. The problem is in the environment. And what was happening is DDT is very persistent, very stable chemical. So it stays in the environment and stays in the fatty tissue in our bodies and in the bodies of animals. And so birds would eat insects that were dying or didn't quite die from the DDT, and they would build up DDT in their bodies. And because of the DDT in their bodies, it was discovered that songbirds were laying eggs with very thin shells. And so the birds would sit on the eggs would crack, the babies would not develop inside the egg, no babies are born, hence the name Silent Spring. No songbirds being born, no songbirds singing in the spring. And it was really well received by the public as this awakening and awareness that we can't keep doing things no matter how good they may seem on one level. DDT is wonderful in saving lives of soldiers and citizens in World War II. We can't just blindly put things in the environment. It's dangerous. And so Silent Spring really can be looked at as the book that started the environmental movement. Even though it didn't really start it, it just triggered what was already welling up in our country. 1963, the Equal Pay Act provides sex-based wage discrimination, or prohibits sex-based wage discrimination. So since 63, we're talking a long time ago. We're talking almost 60 years ago, and we're still working on sex-based wage discrimination. It's still happening. It's just illegal to do it now. People just find different ways of doing it. We're still trying to fix that problem, but at least this is a step in the right direction in 1963. 1964 Civil Rights Act made racial discrimination and segregation illegal. This is the Civil Rights Act that most people point to. And when you think of Martin Luther King Jr., you think of the Civil Rights Act, you usually are thinking 1964, even though much of the initial efforts started in the 1950s. Voting Rights Act of 1965 abolishes a poll tax, opening up polling or voting rights to people without having to pay a poll tax, basically discriminating against people who couldn't afford to vote. 1966, the first monitoring program established to determine the effects of typical agricultural pesticide use, again, looking at safety. Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 protects individuals who are 40 years of age or older from discrimination. Again, does it happen? Of course it does, but at least there's something saying you're not supposed to do that. NEPA, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act was passed. Again, late 1960s, we're now starting to see the effects of that environmental movement of Silent Spring in 1962. It's now hitting the federal laws and regulations. We're getting the National Environmental Policy Act. Plant Variety Protection Act, we'll talk about that at a later date. Council on Environmental Quality, Environment, 1970. Environmental Protection Agency established. A new regulatory agency, 1970. Again, this late 60s to early 70s, all of this environmental concern in the population of the United States is becoming law. 1971, Occupational Safety and Health Act established the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So the environment isn't the only thing going on, it's also worker protection, public protection as well. Employment Standards Administration is established. So again, looking at worker protection. Right away after that, 1972, Federal Water Pollution Control Act and the Clean Air Act. The banning of DDT, I just mentioned that with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. So, boom. Environment, environment, environment. Endangered Species Act, the environment. All of this happening in rapid succession. And this period right here is Richard Nixon, which many of you may only know about. Wasn't he that guy who was impeached? And actually he resigned before he was impeached, but it was that whole Watergate scandal. And, a lot of people think, oh, he's this evil president and this evil Republican anti-environment person, but I'm certainly not going to hold him up on a pedestal because I do not think he was a good human being in many ways. But I have to give him credit. He signed all of these environmental legislative acts and made them law, and they are the foundation of our environmental law today. Please pause and read this. I'm not going to take any more time on this page, but as I mentioned before, the 80s and 90s were largely about fixing things, adding detail, making the regulations work better for industry. The law maybe didn't change much at all, but the regulations did, or maybe the law was amended. 89, the Americans with Disabilities Act, again, a very important legislative action to address many discriminatory practices against people with disabilities. 93, this was under President Clinton, the Family Medical Leave Act. So employers are required, if they have a certain level of number of employees, I think if the number is 50 or more, you have to grant your eligible employees unpaid leave during a 12-month period for the birth of a child, the care of a newborn, or an adopted child, care of an immediate family member who might be sick. There are a number of reasons why you might be able to get the Family and Medical Leave Act. 2006, kaboom! Food safety has always been a modern issue, but 2006, it exploded because there were a series of things going on that mostly were falling under the radar, but a couple of things happened. There was an E. coli outbreak that killed a whole bunch of people. And E. coli, we all have it in our guts, but this particular strain of E. coli is something that creates a byproduct when it's digesting its food that we don't digest properly. And this toxin that we can't digest properly damages our kidneys, causes HUS, which is a kidney failure disease, and can kill you. And so that was one major thing. Social media was another major thing. And changes in the media itself, the newspapers and TV news shows, things like that. All of a sudden, people would grab on to these food safety issues where they weren't newsworthy before. But because of all these things coming together, the 2006 E. coli outbreak really exploded food safety into the minds of the public. And I'll talk more about that when we talk about food safety. 2011, actually it was signed in 2010, I believe, but it didn't become effective until 2011. This was under Obama, President Obama. The FDA's, or Food and Drug Administration's, Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. So it's under FDA because they are the primary regulatory agency, but FSMA is what it is called. You need to know FSMA. You need to know what FSMA is. Food Safety Modernization Act. It really brought food safety to the forefront of agricultural and food manufacturing concerns. This is mostly about ag production and food processing. It's not so much about the restaurants and the grocery stores, although they are touched. Everything is touched in the FSMA Act. Fortunately, the local Central California agricultural community had some very strong voices that was able to provide dramatic input through what's called the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement. And it made the FSMA final draft from the federal government more realistic. What the federal government was first proposing was absurd. They had absolutely no idea how agriculture really worked in terms of the timing and logistics. And the original draft of FSMA was arguably a disastrous draft if it were to be implemented. But fortunately, we were prepared. We got our voices heard, and the current FSMA largely took what we gave them for the leafy vegetables and berries and used that, largely because we were citing FDA information going back to the 90s. So we were using their information as the foundation for why we were making these recommendations. And the government loves when you give them something ready to go, and all they have to do is kind of massage it and call it a law. It saves them work. They're willing to do it. So what we have now, initially, a lot of growers were panicking, saying this is a bunch of crap and I can't do this, it's way too expensive, and this is going to bankrupt the industry. There was so much talk in 2009, 10, 11, all the way up until probably 2015 that I just couldn't believe how much people were pushing back. Now everybody just takes it for granted. Everybody's figured it out. Everybody's learned to work with it. Yeah, there's some problems. Yeah, that it takes some extra work, but it's important work. 2016, Congress approves the GMO labeling law, a bill that requires the labeling of bioengineered food, including the option to use QR codes. I could go on about this. My background is in genetics. I'm a PhD in genetics and did agricultural genetics research for many years before kind of landing at Hartnell in an unexpected way. But I'll just say that if something is a genetically modified organism, a GMO, that doesn't mean much of anything that is of value to the consumer. People think a lot of times GMOs are unhealthy, they're unsafe. I'll talk about this at a later time, but it's a bunch of baloney. It's fear mongering. It's not true. GMO really doesn't give you any useful information on its own. And the idea that we have to label for it is absurd. But it's public interest, public pushing, money, and fear. And there are a lot of powerful interests that wanted the labels for marketing purposes because they wanted to market other types of products. And anyway, if you're scared of GMOs, don't be, but we'll talk about that at a later time. So that is it for the history. You need to write up a paper on this. I won't remind you on every lecture about writing up a summary paper, but focus on the big picture, the eras as I describe them and are written in the same module that this PowerPoint and video series are located. And then pick out some highlights that illustrate that, focusing especially on the ones that are bold, but just bring out some important highlights. And that's what you need to do in your paper. If you have any questions, my cell phone number is in the syllabus, or you can send me a Canvas inbox message. See you next time.